Okay, there are a number of parenting issues that we need to consider. Discipline, medicalization of childhood, overscheduling, and the impact of media, technology, and in particular, in terms of media exposure and the use of technology, we really need to start thinking about exposure to violence. So let's start with spanking. So, physical punishment stops misbehavior in the short term, but usually has serious long term negative outcomes. And much of the research has drawn the conclusion that spanking increases externalizing behavior, and externalizing behavior becomes more severe between ages 1 and 5. Consequently, spanking often becomes harsher by the time children are 6 years old, thus creating a vicious cycle. So, the idea here is you use spanking as discipline. Children, as part of development, become more externalizing, they become more um, physical in their development, and then you reaffirm that aggressive externalizing tendency by spanking. And that's how this vicious cycle um, starts. When children who were punished physically at an early age enter preschool, they have more behavior problems. So we've seen research document things such as talking back to teachers, fighting with classmates, than children who were not spanked. And what we see is the negative effects of corporal punishment continue into adolescence and adulthood. Adolescents who grow up in authoritarian homes, and like we mentioned when we talked about um, parenting styles, authoritarian parents often use physical punishment as a form of discipline. And those adolescents who grow up in those homes are more likely than children raised in authoritative homes to experience depressive symptoms such as sadness and anxiety, as well as mood swings and having low self esteem or low self worth. They're more likely than their non spanked counterparts to hit their parents and other children, and to physically abuse their dating and marital partners and their own children in later life. So basically, physical punishment of children increases aggressive behavior in one's own life and later in life. And because of these empirical findings, most researchers and pediatricians believe that physical punishment is not acceptable. They recommend non physical forms of punishment, such as removing temptations to misbehave, making rules simple, being consistent, setting a good example, and disciplining with love and patience instead of anger. And so, the thing with spanking is that many parents really struggle with this. People that are more likely to endorse the use of spanking were often spanked themselves. And they think, well, spanking works. I know for myself that if I was going to get spanked, I wouldn't do something if I was threatened with spanking or being physically punished. But the reality is, the statistics really speak that this form of discipline is not helpful and has consequences that we pretty much across the board see as not healthy. And like I've mentioned, there's a number of articles that I have tweeted about spanking, that the research is really consistent. Unfortunately, this is one of those areas where the research is very consistent, but individuals, parents are still choosing to spank. And even young adults believe that they will likely spank their children because they're okay and they know that they think that it works. Because again, like I said, spanking does stop behavior in the short term. What it also does, and what people are sort of unwilling to recognize, are the implications of reinforcing aggressive behavior. So one of the other issues are the medicalization of childhood. And what this really means is thinking about problem behaviors such as ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder in childhood, and how we have increasingly started to prescribe medication for what could be relatively normal child development processes. For instance, um, a lot of children are diagnosed with ADHD in elementary school, but elementary schools are not really set up to provide children with enough outlets for their energy. We Our systems in place sort of try to get them to focus and be quiet and stay in their space, things that are not automatic for children. And as a as a consequence of that, we've started labeling more behavior as problematic or as an illness or a disorder or something non-normative that may require medical treatment. So children that may have just been normal children 20 years ago are now being diagnosed and offered stimulants and medication. And because of the growing use of medicalization, there is a belief with some that we are over medicating children. So, a study of 200,000 children between the ages of 2 and 4 found that almost 2% of those kids were receiving stimulants, antidepressants, or tranquilizers. And again, this is ages 2 to 4, ages that technically shouldn't meet the criteria for a diagnostical statistical manual, which is what the DSM stands for. They don't even meet the criteria for a particular diagnosis because it's too early to diagnose children, but we are still prescribing to them. In 2002, psychiatrists prescribed antipsychotic drugs to children and adolescents at 5 times the rate that they did in 1993. A third of children, primarily white boys, were diagnosed as having behavior disorders and received new drugs that were typically previously given only to adults. So the idea here is that we really need to think about what we consider normal, acceptable behavior for children and what we are considering behavior that now requires a diagnosis or medical treatment. And because of the emphasis on testing and success and what that means for later in life, which of course as parents we want to emphasize, are we seeking medication at times that perhaps we need to consider behavioral interventions or other interventions that will have less consequences on children and their families. Another issue is the idea of overscheduling. So this is really talking about, we talked about that video of where helicopter parenting sort of had its roots with the play date. So not only are we now having a play date, but we are also getting our children involved in a range of activities at particular times. And many child development professionals, as well as family scientists, believe that children's lives are actually too busy, that they need more free play in order to enrich imagination, curiosity, creativity, and then just experiencing those normal interactions with peers that might not be governed by adults all the time. So basically, we've seen in the research that children have lost about 12 hours of free time play a week, including unstructured play at home and outside. And yes, while these organized and more sedentary activities can be helpful and provide opportunities to children, the replacing the free time is not necessarily a good thing for all children. One of the professionals that is really advocating this overscheduling position is psychologist David Elkind. He's criticized children's hurried lives and scolding parents for pushing children to grow up too fast. Um, Others argue that not having enough free play has been greatly exaggerated. Structured activities do increase children's self-confidence and provide valuable interpersonal interactions. And only about 6% of adolescents spend more than 20 hours a week in highly organized activities. And there are benefits to these activities, such as exciting, enjoyable new skills, interact with both peers and adults, which you might not get the adult interaction with free play. And it decreases the likelihood of engaging in unhealthy behaviors such as smoking, drinking, and using drugs. But one of the things to consider are, do all children need to be scheduled to the degree that they are? And what does overscheduling then limit in a child's daily schedule? So, one of the other issues that I find particularly fascinating and is sort of ever evolving in terms of the research is the impact of electronic media. So previously, parents were told by the American Academy of Pediatrics and others that children under the age of 2 should not have devices, such as the children in this that having the smartphones in this image, or iPads, etc. But the American Academy of Pediatrics has now revised their statement saying that no, we were wrong. We don't think that electronic media should be outlawed across the board for under 2, because we have seen some actually good benefits in terms of recognition of letters, shapes, numbers, colors, different things like that, that devices can actually provide and facilitate, things like hand-eye coordination, etc. But it is pretty clear that across the board, computer technology has revolutionized parenting. And we're getting more nuanced research of the benefits and the drawbacks of that. In particular, people have been really interested in terms of exposure to violence, whether that is through TV, cartoons, video games, etc. There's a really interesting study, or American Psychological Association brief on violence in the media. And basically what they found is that, in particular among young children, that exposure to violence creates a desensitizing effect and the potential for aggression. So what this means is that children may become less sensitive to the pain and suffering of others when they see violence and aggression. Children may be more fearful of the world around them, so being exposed to violence and aggression creates fear and worry for children. And children may be more likely to behave in aggressive or harmful ways towards others when they are exposed to violence. So several meta-analytic reviews have reported negative effects of exposure to violence in video games, and the evidence strongly suggests that exposure to violent video games is a causal risk factor for increased aggressive behavior, aggressive cognition, or what that means is aggressive thoughts, and aggressive affect, and for decreased empathy and pro-social behavior. So basically, what we are seeing is, in much of the research, that there is exposure to violence does lead to this desensitizing effect. And potentially, for some, it leads to increased aggressive behavior. One of the other things with the impact of electronic media that moves us into sort of middle childhood and adolescence and young adulthood is the effect of cyberbullying. And this is the willful and repeated harm to others using computers, cell phones, or other electronic devices. And so now that we see that everybody has a smartphone, um, kids can post things or be mean or vindictive or sort of the mean girls or the teasing that some boys participate in is done online as well. So not only so it's not limited to school or these in-person interactions, but um, it has shown up in these other areas of interaction. And people really do need to be mindful of this. If you remember the video that I showed, flipping if we grew up in a world where same-sex attraction was the norm, you saw the impact of that social media, that she kept getting texts and things on her social page that were making fun of her and teasing her and basically bullying her. And these kinds of things are very relevant for teens and kids, young kids. So, as we wrap up this raising children and the parenting chapter, it is important to sort of be aware of some of these big trends. So overall, parents nowadays believe that they've lost some of the authority in raising children that they had in past generations. So parents believe that sort of back in the day, in the 50s and 60s and before, that children respected their parents more than they do now. Also, their parents need to be mindful that they aren't the only ones making decisions or the authority figures in their children's lives. We have schools and administrators that are involved and are mandated reporters. We have people in the community that perhaps are more invested in children. You remember the concerned citizen in the video of the free range parenting video where their children were walking to the park that was concerned that children are walking alone. And so these are the kinds of things, and also the degree to which social services can get involved. That parents believe that they've lost some of the authority that they sort of alone held as parents. Now, people in general and society has things in place to protect children that perhaps parents aren't making the best decisions. Parents also believe that they have increased responsibility because a growing number of states are passing laws that affect parents as much as children, such as leaving a child alone in a car. So I can't, technically, it is illegal for me to leave my 9-year-old in the car, even if it's locked and it's not the weather is mild, etc., when I go into Rite Aid to pick up a prescription. That I think the state law in Virginia is that children cannot be alone in a car unless they are 12 years old or older. So these are the kinds of laws that really do affect sort of parenting practices and choices that parents make. Okay, so we're going to talk about the next slides that are up for chapter 12 on Monday. I'm going to introduce you to this model of family functioning that is called the Olson circumplex model. So we're going to work on this on Monday and do an in-class activity around this model.